An analysis of the military ineptitude of Joseph Stalin during the Second World War. Stalin began his military career in the Soviet Union early. By positioning himself close to Lenin, while also guaranteeing Georgian support, Stalin was able to gain significant responsibility over the Red Army. Stalin began his military career during the Russian Civil War. During the conflict, Stalin became infamous for his disagreements with Trotsky, his cruelty towards the enemy, as well as his intimidation of the peasantry through any means possible. Stalin's first military embarrassment came during the Polish-Soviet War. He was given command of the Southern Front, and with this power, decided to stubbornly try and take the city of Lviv. Stalin also refused to give any troops to his political rival Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who needed them dearly for his upcoming battle to try and take Warsaw. Stalin's decisions would eventually cause the Soviets to lose both battles, while also losing the war. He then returned to Moscow in shame and resigned his military command. However, in early 1921, Stalin was able to save face militarily with his leadership during the Soviet invasion of Georgia. Despite his Georgian nationality, Stalin was able to successfully incorporate Georgia into the Soviet Union, beginning decades of repression. With the death of Lenin in 1924, Stalin was able to slowly but surely consolidate his power over the latter half of the 20th. Much of Stalin's strength, however, stemmed from systematic purges. These mass killings were directly aimed at intellectuals, politicians, but more importantly, army officials. Despite the ever-growing threat from Hitler's Germany in the West, Stalin oversaw the mock trials and eventual executions of many troublesome army heads. Among the victims included 3 of the top 5 generals in all of the Soviet Union. Stalin's old political rival, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, was interrogated, tortured, and eventually shot in 1937. Vasily Bloiker was convicted of spying for the Japanese and killed in 1938. And after being criticized by his fellow officers, Alexander Yegorov was also killed in 1939. Apart from the major marshals, however, lesser officers were also purged. In the years leading up to both the Winter War and World War II, 13 of 15 Army commanders, or lesser generals, were purged. 50 of 57 Army Corps commanders were removed. 154 of 186 division commanders removed, as well as countless other commissars. And while a large percentage of purged officers would eventually go on to return to their posts, a significant gap within the Red Army had been created, right on the eve of its invasion of Finland in 1939. Finland was a country that had actually declared its independence during the Russian Revolution of 1917. And while Lenin had actually been a supporter of Finnish self-determination, Stalin had always wanted to take it back for the Soviet Union. Thus, with vastly greater numbers and armaments, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, beginning the Winter War of 1939. Despite the Soviets' numerical advantages, they would be embarrassed in the war, largely due to the lack of leadership, along with the Finns' knowledge of the Arctic terrain. In only 5 months of fighting, the Soviets would end up losing over 120,000 men. But the true extent of Stalin's failure in Finland can actually be seen through this short video.
For every Finnish soldier that died, 5 Soviet soldiers died. For every Finnish aircraft that went down, 10 Soviet aircraft went down. And for every Finnish tank that was destroyed, a massive 100 Soviet tanks were destroyed.
But Stalin's defeat at the hands of his smaller Scandinavian neighbor would not be the last of his military mistakes. He also foolishly believed that Hitler would adhere to his word in regards to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But as Hitler prepared for an inevitable invasion of the Soviet Union, Stalin saw fit to purge the military once again. In early 1941, the commissariats of Air Force, ammunition, and armaments would all be purged, and Soviet defenses were left unbolstered. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa commenced on June 22, 1941. The well-prepared, well-equipped, and well-trained Nazi army proceeded to defeat the Soviet Union at almost every turn. In the first few months of the war, the Soviet army lost battles at Minsk, Smolensk, Uman, Kiev, and Leningrad was also surrounded. Millions of Red Army soldiers fell victim in these early months, and even more were captured.
In August 1941, Stalin responded to the drastic retreat by issuing Order Number 270. This stated that any soldier trying to desert or surrender would be shot, and their family would either be arrested or denied welfare.
With his willingness to accept extremely large casualties, as well as his mobilization of millions of troops from the east, Stalin was successfully able to keep Hitler from taking both Leningrad and Moscow.
Having successfully defended two of Russia's major cities, Stalin then decided to go against the advice of his generals and counterattack against the Germans. In May 1942, Soviet forces tried to retake the city of Kharkov from the Germans. There they were swiftly defeated at the cost of 200,000 men. Reinvigorated by their victory at Kharkov, the Germans cut south towards the Crimean Peninsula, capturing over 600,000 Soviet troops on their way, paving the road to yet another major Soviet city, Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 is largely known as the turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. Determined to stamp out a city with Stalin's own name on it, Hitler devoted a massive amount of forces to the cause. After months upon months of brutal urban fighting, combined with another deadly Russian winter, the Soviets were able to decimate the German forces in Stalingrad. However, their largest victory in the war would come at a very heavy price. Over 1 million Soviet troops would end up losing their lives in the battle alone. These horrible losses were only made worse with Stalin's Order Number 227. This new Stalinist order established easily expendable criminal platoons that could be goaded into suicide missions. This placed barrier troops at the back of any Soviet military charge. These troops would then be ordered to mow down any Soviet troops trying to retreat. But while Stalin saw it as a useful deterrent from retreat, Red Army soldiers came to hate the order as well as the officers that upheld it. And so, Stalin's handling of the Battle of Stalingrad actually proved detrimental to the war effort overall. Even as momentum shifted the Soviet Union's way, Stalin had been outed as an ineffectual military commander and would slowly but surely give power back to his generals, while returning to what he did best, politics. Stalin's gradual removal from military affairs can largely be attributed to the actions of Georgy Zhukov, who, unlike his fellow military officials, was unafraid to challenge Stalin's opinion. Zhukov also mastered the ability to read Stalin's mood, and Stalin in turn respected him for his independent streak.
And so, the veteran general behind the Soviet victories at Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad would be granted the majority of responsibility over the fighting on the Eastern Front. The events that would follow would exhibit how the war should have been fought from the beginning. With experienced military men now in the driver's seat, Soviet generals turned to Kursk, where Stalin suggested a counteroffensive. But sensing an upcoming German attack, Zhukov instead decided to establish defensive positions in Kursk. The German attack was repelled and followed up with a massive counterattack by the Soviets. German forces were forced to retreat, giving the Soviet army its first successful counteroffensive of the entire war. After finally regaining territory,
Zhukov and his generals opened the offensive floodgates, driving Axis forces out of Russia, the Ukraine, Baltic states, Romania, and Poland. For the last 2 years of the war, Soviet defeat became the exception rather than the norm.
Thus, by May 1945, the Soviets were able to take Berlin and effectively end the war in Europe. With the end of the war, Stalin was revered as the savior of the Soviet Union.
And in truth, he did have some major contributions to the victory. These included the successful evacuation of industry eastward, as well as the initial peace with Japan.